Welcome to our deep dive, everybody. Today we're taking on Franz Kafka's The Trial. It's a book that just makes you think, We're going to unpack all the big moments and the characters, of course, and just really try to understand what Kafka's trying to tell us.
It's definitely not always clear. Like Kafka's style, it can be super surreal.
Yeah.
And allegorical. It's kind of like, you wake up from this dream, but you're still kind of freaked out by it hours later.
Exactly. You get that feeling right away with Joseph K's arrest. I mean, come on, he's arrested right in his own apartment.
Oh, yeah. Talk about a rude awakening. And they never actually tell him what he's supposed to have done.
That's got to be the worst part. Like, at least tell me what I'm being accused of, right? But these officers, they're more into small talk than actually explaining anything. It's so bizarre.
Right. And that's Kafka for you. He takes this crazy situation and then adds these really ordinary details. Like, the officers are just chatting away, like it's no big deal.
But it is a big deal. Kay is understandably freaking out. He tries to reason with them, be all logical and everything, but it's like talking to a brick wall.
It's like they're not even seeing him as a person.
Yeah.
He's just another case file to them. And that whole dehumanizing aspect of bureaucracy, that's a big theme in the trial.
Oh, absolutely. And it gets even worse during Kay's first interrogation. It's like, where do they even have this thing? In his neighbor's apartment with a whole audience of random people just watching.
Right, like, hello, where's the courtroom? It's just adding to this whole feeling of absurdity. And then you've got the supervisor there. He's supposed to be in charge, but he's completely useless. He's more interested in comparing his fingers than actually answering Kay's questions.
It's like Kafka is showing us how these systems, they just chew people up and spit them out. There's no respect for the individual, for their right to understand what's happening.
Totally. Kay just becomes another cog in the machine.
It's
gotta be so frustrating. Have you ever tried to reason with someone and you realize they're not even listening? They've already made up their mind. It's like that, but times 1,000.
Oh, I can only imagine. And as if things weren't weird enough already, we then meet the court usher. And that guy, he's a whole other level of messed up.
Oh yeah, he's like the poster child for corruption. The way he talks about the student and how the student supposedly has all this influence with the court, it's just creepy.
It's disturbing. Remember that whole thing about crushing the student? What was that all about?
Well, I think it shows the violence that's kind of lurking beneath the surface of all this, like the system might seem orderly on the outside, but there's this dark undercurrent to it.
For sure. And then the usher actually tries to get Kay involved in all this mess. He suggests Kay could, use his position to make things better. It's like, whoa, hold on a second.
Right. It's that classic dilemma. Do you compromise your own morals to get ahead? Especially when you're dealing with a system that's already corrupt. It's a question that Kay wrestles with throughout the book.
Totally. And as Kay gets pulled deeper into this whole court world, it starts to mess with his head. You can actually see it in the way he experiences the physical spaces of the court offices. He gets lost in this bureaucratic labyrinth.
It's like Kafka is taking Kay's internal state, all that confusion and anxiety, and turning it into a physical reality. The court offices become this external manifestation of Kay's internal struggle.
Yeah, like remember that sick room where Kay almost faints from how oppressive it is? It's not just a room, it's a whole vibe.
Exactly. And then there are all those other defendants just waiting around. They're all hunched over, barely even talking. It's creepy, man.
And they're like ghosts of Kay's potential future. If he doesn't figure out how to play this game, he could end up just like them.
Oh, for sure. And then things take a really dark turn with the flogging scene. It's brutal, and it really shows Kay just how much power this court actually has.
Yeah, I mean, he tries to intervene to stop it, but he can't. He's completely powerless. And it's like, up until that point, he's been trying to reason with the system to understand it, but now he sees the raw violence behind it.
Totally. It's like the mask slips,
Yeah.
and Kay realizes just how arbitrary and cruel this whole thing is. He's forced to confront this reality, and it shakes him to his core.
It's definitely a turning point. Like, now he knows he can't just play by the rules, because there are no rules, at least not any that make sense to him.
Exactly. And that realization is what leads him to start looking for help outside the system. But that's a whole other can of worms. So Kay is realizing he's in way over his head, right? He can't just logic his way out of this mess. So he starts looking for help, but
that's almost worse, isn't it? It's like out of the frying pan and into the fire.
kinda, yeah. His uncle hooks him up with this lawyer, Hold, who's supposed to be like the best of the best, but
he's like the opposite of helpful. I mean, Kay wants answers, a plan, something, and this whole guy, he's just spouting riddles.
it's like Kafka's doing this thing again where he contrasts characters to show how messed up the system is. Like, you've got the uncle, who's at least trying to be practical, using his connections, trying to work the system from the inside.
Right, but then you have the lawyer who's all about secrecy and power plays and never actually explaining anything. It's got to be maddening for Kay.
Oh, totally. Like,
Yeah.
just tell me what's going on. But that's the thing with the trial, right? It's all about this ambiguity, this lack of transparency. It keeps Kay constantly on edge, never knowing if he's doing the right thing.
It's like the trial itself becomes a form of torture, even outside the actual courtroom. He can't escape it. It even starts bleeding into his work life.
Yeah, remember that scene where he's meeting with the manufacturer? He's trying to do his job, secure this contract for the bank, but he just can't focus.
Right. He keeps thinking everyone's talking about him, whispering behind his back. It's like the trial has gotten inside his head.
Exactly. The paranoia just keeps building. And then there's that creepy scene where he goes back to the bank after hours. Remember, he's drawn back to the scene of the flogging.
That scene in the junk room is just so unnerving. The way Kafka builds the tension with all that silence and anticipation.
And the thing is, Kay doesn't even confront the flogger. He just stands there, listening at the door, frozen by indecision.
Like, he knows something terrible happened there, but he can't bring himself to actually face it head on. It's like the not knowing is scarier than the knowing.
Totally. And I think that's when Kay really starts to realize he's on his own in this. The lawyer's not really helping, the court's this crazy labyrinth, and even his own family, his uncle, they just don't get it.
So he's basically alone up against this massive, uncaring system. It's pretty bleak, right?
It is. But Kay doesn't give up, at least not entirely. He's like, okay, fine, I'll do this myself. So he starts thinking about writing this huge, detailed account of his life, like everything he's ever done to prove he's innocent.
I can't even imagine trying to do that. It's like writing your own autobiography. But I guess when you're facing a system like this, you feel like you got to try everything, right?
It's like a last-ditch effort to regain some control, to show the court, hey, I'm a person, I have a story. But as Kay starts working on this thing, he realizes just how impossible it is.
Right. It would consume his entire life, like no job, no friends, no anything.
And even then, there's no guarantee it'll work. The court could just twist everything he says, use it against him.
So it's a lose-lose situation. If he writes it, he sacrifices his whole life. And if he doesn't, he's basically given up. There's no way out.
It's that classic Kafka trap. And in the end, that's exactly what pushes Kay to make another big decision. He fires the lawyer.
But doesn't that just make him even more vulnerable? I mean, the lawyer was useless, sure, but at least he was something.
It's a gamble, for sure. But that's the question we got to ask ourselves as we move into the final part of our deep dive. What happens when you take away the last shred of security, the last illusion of help?
Okay, so Kay is on his own now. No lawyer, no clear plan. It's like he's decided to just go all in and fight this thing head on.
Yeah, he's definitely taken a risk. But you got to remember how frustrated he is with the whole process, right? The lawyer's just stringing him along. The court's this big mystery he can't figure out. He's looking for any way to take back some control.
And that whole encounter with Block, the other guy who's been stuck with the lawyer for years, that's like a cautionary tale, right?
Oh, absolutely. Block is like the worst case scenario. He's totally given up, put all his faith in the lawyer and the system, and it's broken him. He's like a ghost of a person.
And that's what Kay's trying to avoid, becoming another Block. He wants to believe he can still make a difference, even if it seems impossible.
Yeah, but the big question is, can he? Because, spoiler alert, the novel doesn't exactly have a happy ending.
Yeah, the trial definitely doesn't end with Kay finding some magical loophole or proving his innocence. In fact, it ends with his execution, which is pretty brutal.
It is. So then you gotta wonder, what's the point of the whole story? If Kay's doomed from the start, why should we even care?
Right, it's like, what are we supposed to take away from all this?
Well, that's the beauty of Kafka. He's not trying to give us easy answers. The trial isn't really about finding solutions. It's about exploring the big questions.
The questions about life and meaning and how we deal with the stuff we can't control.
Exactly. And about how we face the absurd. Because let's face it, life can be pretty absurd sometimes, right? Just like the world of the trial.
Oh, absolutely. But even though Kay's story ends tragically, there's something about his final moments that I find kind of powerful.
You mean that part where he's watching his own execution?
Yeah.
Almost like he's detached from it?
Yeah. It's like, in that moment, he accepts the absurdity of it all. He doesn't fight back, he doesn't beg for mercy, he just observes.
I think that's what makes the trial so timeless. It speaks to this feeling we all have sometimes, this feeling of being trapped, of being powerless against forces we don't understand. But even in the face of that, there's a part of us that wants to hold on to our own sense of self, our own dignity.
So it's not a hopeful story, exactly, but it's a story about resilience, about how Even when everything seems hopeless, there's a part of us that keeps fighting.
Yeah. And that's a powerful message, I think. Especially in a world where it can feel like we're constantly up against these massive impersonal systems. Like, how do we navigate that without losing ourselves?
That's a question worth asking ourselves for sure. So, as we wrap up our deep dive into the trial, I gotta say, it's a tough book, but it's one that will stay with you. And if you're up for the challenge, I highly recommend checking it out.
It'll make you think. It might even make you uncomfortable. But that's the power of great literature, right? It forces us to confront the big questions, the things we might otherwise try to avoid.
So dive in, folks. See what you make of Kafka's twisted world. You might just find some unexpected truths about your own